Hey, what the hell are you doing? People like you clean floors not think. James Carter stopped instantly, the wet mop resting against the marble floor, leaving a faint streak behind. He didn't look up right away. Men in his position learned early contact could be mistaken for defiance. I'm sorry, sir, James said quietly. I didn't mean anything, I was just cleaning, that's all. Then, ha 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 ha, the laughter burst out loud, careless, cutting through the empty restaurant. William Harrington leaned back in his chair, one leg lifting and landing heavily on the edge of the table. His friend beside him tilted his head, eyes scanning James from top to bottom. Look at him, the friend said, grinning wide. Man's dressed like a walking mop himself. Ah, yeah, William added, shaking his head. You miss a spot, or is that just part of the uniform? The two men laughed again, louder this time, sharper, deliberate. James kept his head down. William reached toward the go-board, picking up a white stone between his fingers. Careful, his friend said mockingly. Wouldn't want him thinking he understands the game just because he looked at it. Another laugh. Then suddenly, William's hand slipped. The board tilted. Black and white stones scattered across the table, then spilled onto the floor. The friend leaned forward immediately, feigning surprise. Oh, wow, look at that, he said. Now it's ruined. William exhaled, slow and annoyed. Unbelievable, he muttered. Then both men turned their eyes directly to James. You see what you did? The friend said sharply. James blinked. Sir, you distracted him. William cut in coldly. Now the board's a mess. Another pause, then calmly pick it up. James didn't argue. He set the mop aside and crouched down, one knee touching the cold marble floor as he began gathering the scattered stones. Black, white, one by one above him. Huh, look at that, the friend whispered, barely hiding his amusement. Right where he belongs. William leaned forward slightly, watching. Then he switched languages again. He said in Hindi, his voice low, mocking. Jameen per. Good, that's where he belongs, on the floor. The friend laughed under his breath. Keep going, he added in English. You're not done. James continued picking up the stones. When he finished, he placed them back on the table. William didn't thank him. Instead, he looked at the board. Then back at James. You ruined the game, he said flatly. So now you're going to fix it. James frowned slightly. Sir, I don't understand. Oh, you will. The friend cut in quickly, grinning. Sit down. He grabbed the back of the chair across from William and dragged it out with a sharp scrape against the floor. Go on, he said. Play. James shook his head. I really should get back to work. William stood abruptly. He stepped closer. Then deliberately he leaned in right to James's face and spoke in Hindi. Slow and clear, every word laced with contempt. He said, people like you can't even think. Then closer still. But today we'll see how stupid you really are. The friend joined in, stepping beside him, laughing softly. Ha ha, yeah. He added, also in Hindi, he probably doesn't even understand what we're saying. They both laughed again. James didn't react, but his hands tightened across the room. Annie had heard everything. She slowly lowered the sandwich in her hands. Her small brows pulled together. Her eyes shifted not to the board, but to her father. Still being spoken to like he wasn't even human. Annie slid off her chair. Her sneakers touched the floor without a sound. One step, then another. Her small figure moved across the empty restaurant, toward the table, toward the men who thought no one understood them. She walked straight into the space that had been filled with laughter-only moments before, her small frame stopping just inches in front of the two men. One hand reached out and held onto her father's sleeve, not pulling him back, not hiding behind him, but standing beside him. Annie, James whispered under his breath, tension tightening every word. Go back. But she didn't move. Her eyes lifted, and when she spoke, she didn't speak in English. She spoke in Hindi. Bus, she said, clear, sharp, and firm. Abruk J, stop. That's enough. William blinked. The friend's smirk froze halfway across his face. Wait, what did she just say? Annie didn't look at him. She kept her eyes locked on William. Still in Hindi, still calm, but now with something stronger underneath. She said, don't think that just because my father says nothing, he understands nothing. That doesn't give you the right to insult him in another language. William's foot slowly slid off the table. His expression didn't disappear, but it changed. He studied her now not as a child but as something unexpected. Then slowly he smiled again, but this time it carried something else. Interesting, he said quietly. Then he turned his head just slightly toward James and switched back to Hindi. He said, a faint edge returning to his voice. Look at this. Can't even stand up for himself. Has to let a child defend his dignity. The friend let out a low, uncertain laugh. Ah, yeah, that's, but William wasn't finished. Still in Hindi. Louder now, he added, staring directly at James. Aren't you ashamed? A little girl has to speak for you because you can't speak for yourself. James didn't respond, but Annie did. Her grip on his sleeve tightened not out of fear but resolve, and she stepped forward enough to stand fully between them. Still speaking Hindi, she said, her voice steady, if this moment moved you, let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Like this video if you believe respect should never be earned through silence, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us what true strength really looks like. He's quiet not because he's weak. He's quiet because he refuses to lower himself to your level. The friend stopped laughing completely. William's smile faded, not gone, but thinner. He leaned forward closer to her height. You understand everything I've said, he replied in Hindi, his tone quieter now, more deliberate. Her ache shoved every single word. Annie didn't flinch. Huh, she answered. A beat passed. Then William straightened, exhaling softly as if making a decision. He said, all right, if you understand, then prove it. He turned his hand and gestured toward the chair across the board. He continued, his eyes locked on hers. Though, if you know so much, then sit in your father's place and play me. The friend blinked. You're serious? William didn't look at him. He was watching Annie, still speaking Hindi. Yafir, he added quietly. Tumbi surfer. Or are you just talking? The challenge still stands. Annie looked at the board, then at her father. James shook his head slightly. Annie, no. But she turned back to William before he could finish. Mungi, she said, I'll play. The friend let out a breath. Huh, this is insane. But William didn't laugh. He wasn't sure how this game was going to end. William Harrington did not sit down immediately. He remained standing for a moment longer, studying the small figure across from him as Annie pulled the chair back with both hands and climbed onto it. The wooden legs scraped softly against the marble floor, a sound that seemed far too loud in the silence that had settled over the room. His friend shifted in his seat, letting out a low, uncertain chuckle. Huh, you're really going through with this? William ignored him. His eyes flicked briefly toward James instead. The look was different now, not amused, not dismissive, but edged with something sharper. Then, as if remembering where he stood, he smirked again. Cut the bad Nikki at Nihoy, he said in Hindi, his voice cool and deliberate, directed straight at James. Betty Koajaria couldn't even sit down himself. Had to send his daughter in his place. The friend snorted softly. Yeah, figures. James said nothing. He remained standing where he was, one hand still gripping the handle of the mop, knuckles pale under the dim light. His eyes were on Annie now, not the board, not the men. Only her. William finally lowered himself into his chair again, slow and controlled, as if reclaiming his position at the table. Toe. He continued in Hindi, glancing briefly at Annie before turning his attention back to James. Yahi hari juga pik rakna, so this is your place. Standing in the back watching a child play your game. The words were meant to cut, and they did, but not in the way William expected, because James didn't react, didn't defend himself, didn't interrupt. He simply watched, and Annie noticed. She didn't respond to William's insult. She didn't rise to it. Instead, she reached forward, her small fingers hovering above the go-board. She didn't touch the stones yet. She studied them, quiet, focused, as if the rest of the room had fallen away. William observed her carefully. Then he leaned back slightly, folding his arms. Nakiho, he said in Hindi, his tone returning to something colder, more structured. If you want to play, understand the rules. He tapped the board lightly. He added, this isn't a game for children. Annie lifted her eyes to meet his. Her expression didn't change. She replied softly, a game is always a game. People just play it differently. A flicker crossed William's face, not irritation, something closer to interest, behind him. His friend shifted again, clearly less comfortable now. William didn't answer. He reached for a black stone, held it between his fingers, then placed it on the board. The sound was precise. He said, first move. Let's see what you do. Annie didn't rush. She looked at the placement, then at the rest of the board. Her father's voice echoed somewhere deep in her memory. Not words exactly, but rhythm. The way he used to sit across from her at a worn-out board at home, explaining not just where to play, but why. Every stone matters, even the smallest one. She reached forward and placed her own stone. Different position, unexpected. William's eyes narrowed slightly. He murmured. The friend leaned forward. What is that, good or bad? William didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed another stone. Faster this time, more direct. Annie answered again without hesitation. The rhythm began to build. Move, response, pressure, release. Across the room, the city lights flickered through the glass windows, reflecting faintly across the board. The restaurant, once filled with noise, now felt like something else entirely, a space holding its breath. William leaned in slightly, his posture tightening. He said quietly. Interesting. You don't play straight moves. Annie tilted her head just slightly. She replied, straight moves are easy to read. Behind her, James felt something shift in his chest. Not fear, not worry, recognition. William placed another stone, this time more carefully. He was no longer playing casually, and he knew it. But still he couldn't let it go. Not yet. His gaze flicked briefly toward James again. He said in Hindi, his voice quieter now, but still sharp. Aren't you ashamed? If you had this much understanding, why didn't you sit down yourself? James remained still, silent, but Annie answered instead without looking away from the board. She said, because he doesn't play to win. He plays to understand. That made William pause just for a moment. Then he placed another stone faster, more aggressive. Annie responded instantly. The board began to shift, shapes forming, territory building, tension rising. The friend leaned closer, squinting. Hey, wait, he muttered. That side. Didn't you already? William raised a hand slightly, silencing him. His eyes were locked on the board now, focused, calculating. Something wasn't lining up. He traced the positions again in his mind. One move ahead, then two, then three. And suddenly, he saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to feel it. A structure forming beneath the surface, a pattern he hadn't noticed before. His jaw tightened slightly. He asked quietly, "Where did you learn that move?" Annie placed another stone. "Gentle precisi papa," she said. "From my dad." William's gaze lifted again, this time not to Annie, but to James. And for the first time that night, there was no mockery in his eyes. Only a question he hadn't asked yet. Because something didn't make sense anymore. A man who stood silent. A man who accepted insult without response. A man in a janitor's uniform should not have been the source of this, should not have been the reason this game was no longer predictable. William leaned back slowly, exhaling under his breath. The balance had shifted. He could feel it now. Not just on the board, but in the room. And somewhere behind him, his friend stopped laughing completely because even he could see it. This wasn't a joke anymore. This was a game. And for the first time since it began, William Harrington wasn't entirely in control of it. The room had changed. Not visibly, not in the furniture, not in the lighting, not in the quiet elegance of the restaurant, but in something far more fragile. The air itself felt tighter, drawn inward toward the small wooden board, where black and white stones now carried a weight far beyond the game. William Harrington no longer leaned back in his chair. He leaned forward, both elbows rested near the edge of the table. His fingers lightly touching one another as his eyes studied the board with a level of focus that had been entirely absent before. The casual arrogance, the half-smile, the careless confidence, it had all thinned into something sharper, more dangerous, more real. Across from him, Annie sat perfectly still, her small hands resting near her lap, her eyes fixed on the evolving shape of the game. She did not fidget. She did not glance around the room. She didn't even look at her father because right now there was only the board. William placed his next stone slowly, not out of hesitation but out of calculation, he said in Hindi, his tone quieter than before. "So, you don't play fast. You think," Annie responded without looking up. She said softly, "People who rush make more mistakes." William's fingers paused for just a fraction of a second. Then he let out a faint breath through his nose. Behind him, his friend shifted again, clearly unsure where to place himself now. The amusement had drained from his expression, replaced by something closer to unease. "Hey, you're overthinking this," he muttered, trying to recover some of the earlier tone. "It's just quiet." William didn't raise his voice, but it was enough. The friend fell silent immediately. The board drew William's attention back again. And this time when he traced the positions, he didn't just look at the present shape. He looked ahead, one move three, and again have felt it. That same subtle pressure Annie had been building from the beginning. Not obvious, not aggressive, but patient, structured, a slow tightening. William's jaw shifted slightly. He said, "You don't fight directly. You wait." Annie tilted her head just a little. She replied, "Sometimes you have to wait to win." That word lingered. Win. William's gaze flicked up for a brief second, not at Annie, at James. And just like before, the edge returned. He said in Hindi, his voice carrying a quiet bite again. "Do you hear that? Your daughter is talking about winning while you just stand there." James didn't answer. He didn't move. But this time, something behind his eyes shifted. Not outwardly, but enough. Enough that Annie felt it without turning around. William noticed it, too, and something about that irritated him more than before. He placed his next stone harder than necessary. A sharper click, a more aggressive linear, he continued still in Hindi, pressing. "Nowadays if you had this much understanding, why didn't you play yourself? Or are you afraid of losing?" Silence followed, but Annie broke it. "Wo di nayan," she said calmly. "He's not afraid." She placed her next stone. "Quiet, he just doesn't play meaningless games." That made William stop. Not dramatically, just enough. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure if she was talking about the board or about him. The tension tightened again. William leaned in closer, studying the formation Annie had just completed. Something wasn't right. No, that wasn't true. Everything was right, too right. He traced the sequence again in his mind. If he pushed forward, she would yield, but not really. If he defended, she would expand. If he ignored, she would close. Every option led somewhere he didn't want to go. His fingers hovered above a stone, paused, lowered, then lifted again. Behind him, the friend swallowed quietly. Hey, what's going on? William didn't respond because now he saw it. Not fully, but enough to understand the shape of it. Unit, not built in one move. Not even in three, but slowly, patiently, from the beginning. He leaned back slightly, not in control this time, but to breathe. He said quietly, you planned this ahead. Annie finally looked up, not proud, not excited, just calm. She said, the game always starts before the first move. William stared at her, then slowly his gaze shifted again to James, and this time there was no mockery, no smile, only a long searching look, as if trying to solve a different kind of puzzle. You taught her, he said in English. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't dismissive, it was measured. James hesitated, then answered quietly. Yes. The word hung in the air. Sampler. Unadorned. True. William exhaled slowly, then looked back at the board. His fingers reached for a stone. But before placing it, he stopped. Because now, for the first time that night, he understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't just a child playing. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This was structure, discipline, training, and somewhere behind all of that, a man who had chosen silence, a man he had mocked, a man he had dismissed. William placed the stone carefully, deliberately, but even as it touched the board, he already knew. The balance had shifted too far. Annie responded immediately. No hesitation, no adjustment, just certainty. And in that moment, William Harrington realized something he had not felt in a very long time. Not in business, not in life, not at any table he had ever sat at. He was no longer the one controlling the outcome. The board was no longer his. The game had already moved beyond him. And somewhere behind Annie, James Carter finally lifted his head, not high, not proud, but enough to no longer look down. Because whether he spoke or not, the truth was already on the table. And this time, everyone in the room could see it. William didn't move right away. His hand hovered above the board, fingers slightly curled as if holding on to a decision that no longer belonged to him. The confidence that had once guided every movement was gone now, replaced by something slower, heavier calculation layered with doubt. Across from him, Annie sat exactly the same. Still, focused, unshaken. The difference was no longer subtle. It was absolute. William finally placed his stone. The sound was softer this time. Controlled, careful, almost cautious. Thun, he murmured in Hindi, more to himself than to anyone else. Abumakiho, let's see what you do now. Annie didn't even pause. Her hand moved immediately, placing a stone in response. No hesitation, no reconsideration, no need to double-check CK. That alone made William's eyes narrow. Not because of the move itself, but because of the certainty behind it. Behind him, his friend shifted again. The earlier arrogance completely drained. Hey, that was fast, he said quietly. She didn't even think. William shook his head slightly. So, Chikia, he said under his breath. She already has. The friend frowned. What? But William didn't explain because now he could see it more clearly. Not just the structure, the intention. Every move Annie made wasn't a reaction. It was continuation, a plan already in motion. He leaned closer to the board again, tracing the shape with his eyes. His breathing slowed, not from calm, but from concentration. He said slowly, you're not just making moves, you're building a path. Annie's voice came quietly in return. She said the path is always there. You just have to see it. That word again. Say William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly because that was exactly what had slipped from him earlier. Not intelligence, not skill. Vision. He placed another stone. This time he tried something different. A disruption. A break in her structure. A move meant not to win but to force her to adapt. To prove she wasn't as far ahead as she seemed. The stone landed. He leaned back slightly. Waited. Annie looked at it for 1 second. Then 2. Then she reached forward and placed her next stone. Direct final. William froze. His fingers still resting near the board went still. The friend leaned in again. What happened? William didn't answer because now he saw it completely. The line he thought he had broken was never hers. It was a decoy, a shape designed to be cut, a distraction. And in cutting it, he had opened exactly what she needed. A quiet exhale left him. Not frustration, not anger, recognition. Chal, he said slowly, almost to himself. Jonki, this move was intentional. Annie didn't look up, she replied. Every move is intentional. Behind her, James felt his grip loosen on the mop handle for the first time since the game began. Not because the tension was gone, but because something else had replaced it. Pride, not loud, not visible, but undeniable. William leaned back in his chair again. But this time, it wasn't to relax. It was to understand. He studied Annie carefully now. Not her size, not her age, her stillness, her patience, her discipline. And slowly his gaze shifted again to James. This time there was no insult waiting behind his words, only something quieter. Tomo's Issa, he said, you taught her. James didn't answer immediately. He looked at Annie at the board, then back at William. Yes, he said simply. The friend let out a breath, shaking his head. Man, this is ridiculous. He muttered. You're telling me a janitor. William raised his hand, not sharply, but enough, Bus, he said. Enough. The friend went quiet because now even he could feel it. The shift. The game wasn't entertainment anymore. It wasn't a joke. It was something else. Something that had turned the room into a place where position no longer mattered. Only truth did. William leaned forward again, slower now, more deliberate. Ari Sal, he said in Hindi, his eyes still on Annie, but his words aimed elsewhere. One last question. His gaze moved to James, he continued. If you knew all this, why didn't you play? The question hung there, not mocking, not cruel, just real. James inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried years behind it. I didn't need to, he said quietly. William watched him, waited. James continued, his voice steady. Some games aren't worth playing. Silence settled again, but this time, it didn't belong to William. It belonged to something deeper, something that had shifted without anyone noticing exactly when. William looked back at the board. Then at Annie, then again at James, and for the first time since the night began, he nodded, not in agreement, not in defeat, in acknowledgement. Then he reached forward, placed his final stone, and leaned back. The move wasn't rushed, it wasn't careless, but it didn't carry expectation anymore, only completion. Annie looked at it, then placed hers, just as quietly, just as certainly. The board settled, the pattern closed, and the outcome was clear. William exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the board for a long moment. Then finally, he spoke. Kutma, he said softly. It's over. The word carried no bitterness, only truth behind him. His friend didn't speak, didn't laugh, didn't move. Because even he understood now. This wasn't about who won. It was about who had seen the game clearly from the beginning. And that had never been William. Across the table, Annie remained still. No smile, no celebration, just quiet. Because to her, the game had simply ended the way it was always going to. And behind her, James Carter stood a little straighter than before. Not because he had proven anything, but because he no longer needed to hide it. Not tonight, not anymore. For a long moment after the final stone settled, no one moved. The board lay quiet between them. Black and white pieces locked in a pattern that no longer needed explanation. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden collapse, no obvious moment of defeat, just a slow, undeniable conclusion that had already happened before the last move was even played. William Harrington leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on the board, not searching anymore, not calculating, just looking as if trying to understand not the game, but what had just happened to him inside it behind him. His friend shifted awkwardly, glancing between the board and William. So that's it? He asked, his voice uncertain now, stripped of the earlier arrogance. You're just going to let it end like that? William didn't answer immediately. He exhaled slowly, then reached forward and lightly touched one of the stones Annie had placed earlier. His finger rested on it for a second longer than necessary. No, he said quietly. It didn't just end. He lifted his gaze first to Annie, then slowly to James. Something in his expression had changed completely now. The mockery was gone. The sharp edges of superiority had dulled into something far more complicated. You saw it from the beginning, he said. It wasn't a question. James didn't respond right away. He stepped forward slightly, leaving the mop where it stood, leaning against the wall. Forgotten for the first time that night. I saw enough, he said. William studied him carefully. Then he nodded once, not as a gesture of agreement, but as recognition, behind him. His friend let out a short, uneasy laugh. All right, okay, I get it, he said, raising his hand slightly. She's smart, really smart, but come on, this doesn't mean. William turned his head slightly. Just enough. The friend stopped talking. The silence that followed wasn't forced. It was accepted. William shifted his attention back to Annie. That tum mujhe hara, he said in Hindi, his tone steady without resistance. You beat me. Annie looked at him and shook her head gently. She replied, no, you defeated yourself. That answer landed deeper than anything else she had said. William didn't react outwardly, but something in his posture stilled again like a man hearing a truth he wasn't ready for, but couldn't deny. He leaned back further in his chair, one hand resting against his chin as he replayed the game in his mind. Not the moves, the moments. The first assumption, the first dismissal, the first time he stopped seeing clearly. It hadn't started with the board. It had started long before that. He let out a quiet breath. Interesting, he murmured. Then he looked at James again. You chose not to play, he said. James nodded. Yes. Why? The question wasn't sharp this time. It wasn't meant to corner or expose. It was genuine. James hesitated, not because he didn't have an answer, but because answers like that didn't come quickly. Because I've played that kind of game before, he said finally. William's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind? James met his gaze. The kind where the outcome doesn't matter, he said. Only the cost. Silence followed again. Deeper now, more personal. William leaned forward slowly, resting his forearms on the table, his attention fully locked on James. You don't look like someone who walks away from games, he said. A faint, almost invisible smile touched the corner of James's mouth. Most people don't understand which games are worth staying in, he replied. That answer stayed in the air longer than anything else had that night because this time, William didn't dismiss it. He absorbed it. Behind him, his friend shifted again, uncomfortable with the direction things had taken. All right, this is getting philosophical, he muttered. We're really doing this now. No one responded because the room had already moved past him. William reached down and adjusted one of the stones slightly, almost absent-mindedly. Then he spoke again. Tumo surf kale nikaya, he said in Hindi, nodding slightly toward Annie. You didn't just teach her the game. James glanced at Annie, then back at him. No, he said quietly. William's eyes returned to Annie. What else did you teach her? He asked. Annie answered this time. She said, when to play and when not to. William let out a soft breath through his nose. There it was again. That clarity, that line he hadn't seen before tonight. He stood up slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just deliberately. For a moment, no one spoke. The chair slid back quietly behind him. His friend straightened instinctively as if expecting the old version of William to return to laugh, to dismiss, to reclaim control. But it didn't happen. Instead, William walked around the table, stopped in front of James. Not too close, but close enough. For a brief second, they stood there in silence. Then William extended his hand. The gesture was simple, but it carried weight. Respect, acknowledgement, something earned, not given. James looked at the hand. Then at William, and after a moment he took it. The handshake was firm, not aggressive, not performative, just real. William nodded slightly. Megalitha, he said quietly in Hindi. I was wrong. James didn't respond with words. He didn't need to because the moment itself said enough. Behind them, Annie watched quietly, her small face calm, her eyes steady. The tension that had filled the room earlier had shifted completely now, not disappeared. Transformed, William released James's hand and stepped back. His gaze returned to the board one last time. Then to Annie. Next time, he said in English. A faint hint of something new in his tone. I'll be ready. Annie tilted her head slightly. Next time, she replied. You'll see sooner. A small pause followed. Then William smiled. Not the sharp cutting smile from before. Something quieter. Something human. He turned toward his friend. We're leaving, he said. The friend blinked. Yeah, okay. They began walking toward the exit, but just before reaching the door, William stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. Then without looking back, he spoke. Some games, he said slowly, are worth losing. The door opened, closed, and the room fell silent again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Because now it wasn't built on humiliation. It was built on something else entirely. Something earned, something understood. James exhaled slowly, his shoulders finally relaxing. He looked down at Annie for a moment. Neither of them spoke. Then he knelt slightly, bringing himself to her level. You shouldn't have had to do that, he said quietly. Annie shook her head. I wanted to, she replied. James studied her face. The calm, the certainty, the strength that had carried her through something no child should have needed to face. Then slowly he nodded. All right, he said. He stood up again, glancing once more at the board, then at the door, then back at Annie. Let's go home. And this time, there was nothing left in the room to prove. The night air outside the restaurant felt colder than it should have. James stepped out first, holding the door open just long enough for Annie to walk through beside him. The city stretched out in front of them, lights flickering across glass buildings, distant traffic humming like a steady pulse. But for a moment, neither of them moved. The silence followed them out. Not heavy, not tense, just full. James let the door close behind them and exhaled slowly, as if something he had been holding inside for years had finally loosened its grip. He glanced down at Annie, who stood quietly at his side, her small hand brushing lightly against his coat. You okay? He asked. Annie nodded. Yes, sampler sir. But James didn't look away. He studied her face, the calm in her eyes, the steadiness that hadn't wavered even once inside that room. It wasn't something a child should have needed to carry. And yet, she had. You didn't have to do that, he said again, softer this time. Annie looked up at him. I know, she said. But you didn't either. That stopped him. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. James looked out at the street for a moment, watching a car pass under a street light, its reflection stretching across the wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed briefly, then faded. I made a choice a long time ago, he said quietly. Sometimes when you make a choice like that, you don't get to explain it to people. Annie listened, not like a child, like someone who had already begun to understand more than she should. But that doesn't mean it's right for everyone, he added. Annie tilted her head slightly. You mean being quiet? James nodded. For me, it was, he said. For you, it might not be. Annie looked down at the ground for a second, then back up at him. You weren't quiet because you didn't know what to say, she said. It wasn't a question. James gave a small, almost tired smile. No, you were quiet because you didn't want to play their game. That one landed differently because it wasn't just understanding. It was clarity. James looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. Yeah, he said, something like that. They started walking side by side, moving down the sidewalk under the glow of street lights, their shadows stretching ahead of them. The city wasn't loud at this hour, but it wasn't asleep either. A few people passed by wrapped in their own worlds, their own concerns, never noticing the quiet shift that had taken place just a few minutes earlier inside a restaurant they would never think twice about. After a few steps, Annie spoke again. He didn't know how to see. James glanced down at her. Who? The man, she said. He thought he was looking at everything, but he wasn't seeing the important parts. James considered that, then nodded slowly. That happens more than people realize. Annie kicked slightly at a small pebble on the ground, watching it roll ahead of them. Will he learn? James let out a soft breath. Maybe, he said. People only learn when they're ready to. And if they're not, he looked up at the buildings again, their windows reflecting 100 different lives at once. Then they keep losing the same game, he said. Annie didn't respond right away. She thought about it, about the board, about the way William had played at the beginning. Fast, certain, already convinced he was winning before the game had even really started. Then about the end, the pause, the realization, the moment everything changed. He said he was wrong, she said. James nodded. He did. That's hard, Annie added. James glanced down at her again. Yeah, he said quietly. It is. They reached a corner and stopped at the crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. A car passed in front of them, its headlights briefly illuminating their faces before disappearing into the night. Annie shifted slightly, then looked up at him again. Why didn't you tell him? She asked. Tell him what? That you understood everything, he said. James was quiet for a second, then he answered. Because it wouldn't have changed anything, he said. Not at the beginning. Annie frowned slightly, but it changed later. James gave a small nod. Yeah, he admitted, but not because of words. He looked down at her, because of what he saw. Annie's eyes moved forward again toward the street, toward the path ahead. The board, she said. The board, James repeated. The light changed. They crossed the street together. Footsteps in sync. Halfway across, Annie spoke again. You taught me that, she said. James raised an eyebrow slightly. Taught you what? That sometimes you don't have to argue, she said. You just have to show the truth. James slowed slightly. Not enough to stop, but enough to feel the weight of that. I guess I did, he said. They reached the other side of the street and continued walking, the rhythm of their steps settling into something quiet and familiar. After a while, Annie reached for his hand. He took it without hesitation. Warm, steady, real. Are you mad? She asked softly. James looked down at her, surprised. Mad? Why would I be mad? Because I didn't listen, she said. You told me to stay back. James stopped walking. Just for a moment, he turned slightly toward her. No, he said gently. I'm not mad. Annie searched his face. Not even a little. James smiled faintly. I'm thinking, he said. About what? He looked at her hand in his, then back at her. About how sometimes, he said slowly. Kids understand things faster than adults. Annie tilted her head. That's because we don't forget things yet, she said. James let out a quiet laugh. Yeah, he said. Maybe that's it. They started walking again. The city stretched ahead of them, quieter now, softer. Behind them, the restaurant faded into just another building, another place in a long line of places that held moments most people would never know about. But for James, it wasn't just another night. Something had shifted. Not because of the game, not because of the man who had walked away, but because of what had happened after. He looked down at Annie again. Hey, he said. Yeah, next time, he added. We picked the game together. Annie smiled slightly. Deal, and for the first time that night, there was nothing left to prove, only something to carry forward. The apartment was small, but it held warmth in a way the restaurant never could. James unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting Annie walk in first. The faint hum of an old refrigerator greeted them, along with the soft creak of wooden floors that had learned every step they had ever taken. Nothing in the space was expensive, nothing polished or designed to impress, but everything in it had a place, a purpose, a memory. Annie slipped off her shoes by the door without being told, setting them neatly beside her father's worn pair. Routine, order, the kind of quiet discipline that didn't need to be spoken. James closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a second longer than usual. Not out of exhaustion, out of thought. The night hadn't followed any path he could have predicted. It had begun like so many others. Silent work, invisible presence, a man passing through spaces where he didn't belong. But it hadn't ended that way. He pushed himself off the door and walked into the small living room. The old go-board sat on the low table near the couch, its edges worn smooth from years of use. The stones rested in two small wooden bowls, their soft clinking sound familiar even before they were touched. Annie moved toward it without hesitation. Of course, she did. James watched her for a moment before speaking. "You're not tired?" he asked. Annie shook her head as she sat down, opening one of the bowls and letting her fingers brush lightly over the stones. "No." James exhaled quietly. "That makes one of us." He moved to the kitchen, filling a glass with water and taking a slow sip before leaning against the counter. From where he stood, he could see her reflection faintly in the dark window behind her. Small, focused, already arranging stones on the board, like the night hadn't ended, like the game hadn't closed. "Set it up?" she asked without looking at him. James hesitated, then nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "Yeah," he said, "set it up." She began placing the stones with careful precision, black and white alternating into their familiar positions. There was no rush, no leftover excitement from the restaurant, no trace of pride in her movements, just quiet attention. James walked over slowly and sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The board sat between them, simpler than the one in the restaurant. Worn by time, but somehow more honest, Annie placed the final stone and looked up. "Same rules?" she asked. James leaned back slightly. "Same rules." A small pause. Then Annie added, "But this time you play." James smiled faintly. "That's the deal, right?" She nodded. He reached into the bowl and picked up a black stone, rolling it gently between his fingers before placing it on the board. The sound was soft, familiar, and this time there was no audience, no judgment, no one watching for weakness, only the game. Annie responded immediately, her white stone settling into place with quiet certainty. They played in silence for a few moves. Not tense, not heavy, just focused. After a while, Annie spoke. "You could have beaten him." James didn't look up. "That wasn't the point." She tilted her head slightly. "It looked like the point." James placed another stone. "Sometimes what it looks like isn't what it is." Annie studied the board, then responded with her move. "But you knew you could win." James paused, then nodded. "Yes." "Then why didn't you?" He exhaled slowly, leaning back just a little. "Because winning isn't always the same as changing something," he said. Annie frowned slightly. "But he changed." James looked at her. "He did," he said. "But not because I beat him." Annie's fingers hovered over a stone before placing it carefully. "Because he saw it." James nodded. "Exactly." The game continued. Their moves began to form patterns different from the ones at the restaurant, but just as deliberate. James played slower than Annie, but not because he didn't know what to do. He watched her, studied her, not the way William had, but the way someone learns from what they've already built. "You didn't like him," Annie said after a while. James gave a quiet, almost amused breath. "No," he admitted, "because he was mean." "That's part of it." Annie looked up. "What's the other part?" James rested his fingers lightly on the edge of the board. "Because he reminded me of something," he said. "Of what?" James didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed another stone. "Of a time when I thought I understood everything," he said finally. Annie's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in curiosity. "And you didn't?" James shook his head. "No." She studied him for a second longer, then returned to the board. "What changed?" James watched her place her stone. Then he looked at the position, the shape she was building, the quiet control behind it. "A loss," he said simply. Annie didn't react immediately, but the words stayed with her. "What kind of loss?" she asked. James leaned back, his eyes drifting for a moment, not away from her, but inward. "The kind that teaches you what matters," he said. Annie absorbed that quietly. Then she made her next move. And for the first time, James didn't respond right away because now he saw something not on the board. Inhale. The patience, the restraint, the clarity. Not just learned, understood. "You didn't just repeat what I taught you tonight," he said slowly. Annie looked up. "No, you changed it." She nodded a little. James smiled faintly. "That's how it works." The room settled into silence again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of something quieter. Growth. After a few more moves, Annie spoke again. "Do you think he'll come back?" James raised an eyebrow slightly. "Why?" Annie shrugged. He said, "Next time." James considered that, then nodded. "Maybe. And if he does?" James looked at the board, then at Hare. "Then we'll see if he learned anything." Annie smiled just a little. "Do you think he will?" James paused, then placed his next stone. "I think," he said. He already started. The game continued. Move after move, stone after stone. Outside the city carried on, unaware of the quiet shift taking place in a small apartment where a man had chosen silence and a child had chosen to speak. And somewhere between those two choices, something stronger had formed. not just a lesson, a path forward, one that neither of them would have to walk alone anymore. Morning came quietly, not with noise or urgency, but with a soft gray light slipping through the thin curtains, settling across the small apartment like something careful not to disturb what had been built the night before. The city outside had already started moving. Cars, voices, footsteps layered into a distant rhythm. But inside, everything remained still for just a little longer. James was already awake. He sat at the edge of the couch, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped together as he stared at the go-board in front of him. The stones were exactly where they had been left. He hadn't touched them, hadn't reset the game, hadn't needed to because it wasn't the board he was looking at. It was everything behind it. The restaurant, the voices, the laughter. The moment Annie stepped forward, the moment everything shifted, he replayed it all. Well, not as a victory, not as something to hold on to, but as something to understand. For years, he had chosen silence. Not because he lacked words, but because he understood the cost of speaking them in the wrong places. He had seen what happened when truth was used carelessly. When pride pushed people into games they could never truly win. But last night, Annie hadn't been careful. She had been clear, and somehow that had been enough. A small sound pulled him from his thoughts. Soft footsteps. He turned his head slightly. Annie stood in the doorway, still in her sleep shirt, hair slightly messy, eyes not fully awake yet, but aware. "You didn't sleep much," she said. It wasn't a question. James gave a faint smile. "Guess not." She walked over slowly and climbed onto the couch beside him, pulling her knees close to her chest as she looked at the board. "You didn't finish the game." James followed her gaze. "No," he said. "I didn't." "Why?" He leaned back slightly, resting his head against the wall. "Because it wasn't about finishing." Annie studied the stones. "But it still matters where it ends." James nodded slowly. "It does." She reached forward, her fingers hovering just above the board, but not touching. "Can I?" James glanced at her, then nodded. "Go ahead." Annie picked up a white stone and placed it carefully. A single move, simpler, but deliberated. James watched it settle. Then he reached forward and responded with a black stone. The game continued, not as it had been before. No tension, no pressure, but as something quieter. A conversation, a continuation. After a few moves, Annie spoke again. "You're thinking about him." James didn't look up. "Yeah, why?" He placed another stone slower this time. "Because people don't usually change that quickly," he said. Annie tilted her head, but he did. James considered that. "Or maybe," he said. He just stopped pretending. That seemed to sit differently. Annie didn't answer right away. She studied the board again. "You think he's always like that?" she asked. James looked at her. "Like what?" "Like he was at the beginning." James exhaled quietly. "Probably," he said. "That kind of confidence. It doesn't come from nowhere." Annie placed another stone. "But it also doesn't mean he's right." James gave a faint nod. "No, it doesn't." They played in silence for a few more moves. Then Annie spoke again. "You didn't defend yourself." James's hand paused slightly above the board. "No," he said, "even when he was wrong." "That's true." Annie looked up at him. "Why?" James leaned back again, taking a slow breath. "Because sometimes defending yourself just pulls you deeper into the same fight," he said. "And I didn't want to fight him." Annie frowned slightly. "But you let him say things that weren't true." James nodded. "Yes, and that's okay." He looked at her. "No," he said, "it's not okay." A small pause. "Then why did it?" James didn't answer immediately. He let the question sit. "Because it deserved to. Because not every wrong needs to be corrected right away," he said finally. "Some people need to see it themselves." Annie considered that carefully. Then she placed another stone. "And if they don't?" James looked at the board, then at Hare. "Then you decide if it's worth showing them." Annie's eyes shifted slightly. "Like I did." James gave a small smile. "Like you did." She didn't smile back, not because she didn't understand, but because she did. After a moment, she spoke again. "Were you scared?" James blinked slightly. "Of what?" "That I would lose." He paused, then shook his head. "No, why not?" He looked at her. "Because you weren't playing to win," he said. "You were playing to show something." Annie looked back at the board. "And that's better." James leaned forward slightly. "It depends on what matters more," he said. The game continued. Move after move. The light in the room slowly shifted from gray to something warmer, softer. Morning had fully arrived, even if neither of them had noticed exactly when. After a while, Annie placed a stone and sat back. "Do you think he'll tell people?" James raised an eyebrow. "About last night." She nodded. James thought about it. The kind of man William had seemed to be. The kind of world he moved in. The kind of people who surrounded him. Then he shook his head. "No." "Why?" "Because people like him don't like being seen that way," he said. "Not at first." Annie looked down. "But maybe later." James smiled faintly. "Maybe. Later." Silence settled again, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with something quieter. Understanding. After a few more moves, Annie spoke again. Are you going to keep working there? James paused. The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. He looked around the apartment. The small table, the worn couch, the board between them, then back at Annie. I don't know, he said honestly. She nodded, not disappointed, not surprised, just accepting. You don't have to decide today, she said. James looked at her, a faint warmth in his expression. No, he agreed. I don't. Annie reached forward and placed another stone, then looked up. But whatever you decide, she said. You shouldn't stay invisible. The words landed quietly, but they stayed. James didn't respond right away because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure he wanted to disappear anymore. He looked at the board again, then at Annie, and slowly he nodded. Yeah, he said, maybe not. The rest of the morning moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if both of them were unwilling to rush past something that hadn't fully settled yet. The game on the board had shifted again. Not toward a clear victory, not toward an obvious ending, but into a space where both players understood that what mattered wasn't the final move. It was what each move revealed. James leaned back slightly, watching Annie study the board with the same quiet focus she had carried into the restaurant the night before. There was no excitement in her expression, no trace of pride, just attention. That alone told him more than any words could. You're holding back, he said. Annie didn't look up. No, I'm not. James raised an eyebrow faintly. You are, he said. You're leaving space. She placed her next stone carefully. I'm giving you a chance to see it, she replied. That made him pause, not because he disagreed, but because the words felt familiar in a way that ran deeper than the game itself. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening as he looked at the shape she had built. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't defensive, it was open, intentionally incomplete, but not weak. You didn't do that last night, he said. Annie finally looked up because he wasn't looking. James held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. That's true. Silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was thoughtful, filled with the quiet sound of understanding settling into place. James placed another stone, this time slower, more deliberate. He didn't try to break her structure. He didn't try to force anything. He followed it, and Annie noticed. You're playing different, she said. James gave a faint smile. Yeah, he admitted. I am. Why? He looked at the board, then back at her. Because I don't need to prove anything here, he said. Annie studied him carefully, as if measuring that answer. Then she nodded once and returned to the game. A few moves passed before she spoke again. What are you going to do today? James leaned back, exhaling slowly. Work, he said. Annie tilted her head. The same place. James hesitated. Not long, but enough. I think so, he said. Why? He looked at her, not surprised by the question, but by how directly she asked it. Because leaving without understanding something doesn't sit right with me, he said. Annie frowned slightly. You already understand it. James shook his head. I understand what happened, he said. That's not the same as understanding what comes next. She thought about that, then placed another stone. So, you're going back to see if it changes. James nodded. Yeah, and if it doesn't, he met her eyes. Then I decide if it's worth staying. Annie leaned back slightly, considering that answer with the same seriousness she gave to the board. After a moment, she nodded. That makes sense. The game continued. The shapes grew more complex, more intertwined. This time, there was no clear lead. No hidden trap waiting to close. Just two players building something together, testing, adjusting, learning. After a few more moves, Annie spoke again. You're not invisible anymore. James's hand paused slightly above the board. He didn't look up. I wasn't invisible, he said quietly. Annie tilted her head. You were choosing not to be seen. That was more accurate. James let out a soft breath. Yeah, he admitted. Annie watched him carefully, but now they saw you. James nodded slowly. They did, and you can't take that back. He placed his next stone. No, he said. I can't. A small pause. Does that bother you? James leaned back again, looking at the board as if the answer might be there. It used to, he said. Annie waited. And now, he looked at her. Now I'm not so sure. That answer lingered because it wasn't complete. And Annie knew it. She didn't push further. Instead, she returned to the board, placing her next stone with quiet certainty. The game stretched on, moving into deeper territory. Each move now carried more weight, not because of competition, but because of what it revealed about how they were both thinking. James studied her again, not as a teacher, as someone watching something grow. You changed something else, he said. Annie looked up. What? You didn't get angry, he said. Not once. She blinked slightly. I wasn't angry. James raised an eyebrow. He was insulting you and me. Annie shrugged lightly. That doesn't mean I have to feel what he wants me to feel. James leaned back, considering that that's not easy. No, she agreed, but it's clear. He gave a faint smile. Clear usually is. The room settled again into that quiet rhythm. Outside, the day had fully begun. The sounds of the city were louder now. Cars, distant voices, footsteps. But inside, everything remained steady. After a while, Annie placed a stone and leaned back. Your move. James looked at the board longer this time because now the position was different. Not balanced, not uncertain. It was approaching an end, but not a forced one, a chosen one. He traced the line slowly, seeing where it could go, what it could become. Then he looked at Annie. You see how this ends? He asked. She nodded. Yes. And you're okay with it? She nodded again. Yes. James studied her face, then placed his final stone. The board settled, not with tension, with agreement. Annie looked at it for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, she said softly. James leaned back. That's enough for now. Annie didn't argue. She began gathering the stones, placing them back into the bowls one by one. The soft clicking sound filled the room again, steady and familiar. James stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the street below. People moved, cars passed, life continued, but something inside him had shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Behind him, Annie finished putting away the stones. Are you going to tell them? She asked. James turned slightly. Tell who? The people at work. He thought about it. About the way they saw him. About the way he had allowed himself to be seen. Then he shook his head. No, he said. Not yet. Annie nodded. Okay. A small pause. Then she added, they'll figure it out. James smiled faintly. Maybe. He grabbed his jacket and keys, moving toward the door. Annie followed, slipping her shoes on again. Ready? He asked. She nodded. Ready. He opened the door, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was stepping into a place where he didn't belong. He stepped forward, and this time, he didn't lower his eyes. The walk back to the restaurant felt different. Not because the streets had changed or the city had slowed or anything in. The world outside had shifted in a visible way. The same traffic moved past them. The same people hurried by with their heads down. The same morning light reflected off glass buildings in sharp, clean lines. But for James, something had settled into place. He didn't rush. He didn't look down. And he didn't feel the quiet pressure he had carried for years. The need to pass through spaces unnoticed, untouched, unchallenged. Annie walked beside him, her hand lightly brushing his coat again, her steps steady and unhurried. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. There was no question left between them that required an answer right now. When they reached the entrance, James paused. Not long, just enough to take a breath. Then he pushed the door open. The restaurant was different in the morning. Brighter, cleaner, less like a stage, and more like a place people worked. Chairs were being set back down, tables wiped, glass polished. A few early staff members moved through their routines, quiet but efficient. No one noticed them at first, and that used to be enough, but today it wasn't something James relied on. He stepped inside, Annie following just behind him, and this time he didn't drift toward the edges of the room. He walked straight through it. One of the waiters glanced up, then paused. It was a small reaction barely visible, but it was there. Recognition, not of what had happened the night before, but of something different. James nodded once as he passed, a simple acknowledgement. The waiter nodded back. Annie noticed that. She didn't say anything. They moved toward the back where the cleaning supplies were kept, where James usually begins his shift. The familiar cart stood where it always did. The same worn handle, the same bucket, the same routine waiting to be picked up again. James reached for it, then stopped. Not because he didn't want to work, but because something about the motion felt incomplete. Behind him, Annie watched quietly. You can still do your job, she said. James glanced back at her. I know, but you don't have to disappear while you do it. The words were simple, but they stayed. James nodded slowly, then took hold of the cart and began moving again. The floor didn't change. The work didn't change, but the way he carried himself did. He didn't lower his shoulders. He didn't avoid the center of the room. He worked fully present as if the space belonged to him just as much as anyone else inside it. A few minutes passed. Then a voice broke the quiet rhythm. Hey, Mike, right. James looked up. One of the younger staff members stood a few steps away holding a stack of folded linens. He looked unsure, like he had debated whether to speak at all. Yeah, James said. The man hesitated, then asked, You were here late last night? James paused for just a moment, then nodded. I was. The man shifted his weight slightly, glancing toward the front of the restaurant, then back again. I heard something happened, he said carefully. James didn't respond immediately, not because he was hiding anything, but because he understood something now that he hadn't fully accepted before. People noticed more than he had assumed. They were just talking, he said. The man studied him for a second, then nodded. Yeah, he said. People like that. They always talk. There was no judgment in his voice, just familiarity. James gave a faint nod in return. Yeah, he said quietly. They do. The man hesitated again, then added. If they gave you a hard time, you don't have to just take it, you know. That almost made James smile. Almost. I know, he said. And this time, he meant it differently. The man nodded once, then moved on, leaving the moment behind as if it had never needed to be more than that. Annie watched the exchange carefully. He saw something, she said. James continued moving the mop across the floor. Maybe, not everything, she added. No, James said, not everything. They worked in silence for a while after that, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't protective, it wasn't hiding anything, it was simply quiet. After some time, Annie wandered toward the dining area, her eyes drifting across the room until they landed on the same table from the night before. The board was gone. Of course, it was. The table had been reset like nothing had ever happened. But Annie stood there for a moment anyway, looking at the empty space, not disappointed, just aware. James noticed. You looking for something? He asked. Annie shook her head. No. Then after a second, just remembering. James leaned slightly on the mop handle. That's not a bad thing. Annie nodded. It helps you see better next time. James looked at her for a moment, then smiled faintly. Yeah, he said, it does. The door at the front of the restaurant opened. A quiet sound, but it carried. Both of them turned slightly, not out of expectation. Just instinct. A man stepped inside, dressed the same way as before. Calm, composed, but not quite the same. William Harrington paused just inside the entrance, his eyes scanning the room briefly, not like someone looking for control, but like someone trying to locate something specific. His gaze moved across the tables, past the staff, until it landed on James and Annie. He didn't look surprised, he didn't look uncertain, but there was no trace of the man who had laughed the night before. Instead, there was intention. He walked forward slowly, not rushing, not drawing attention, but not avoiding it either. The room shifted slightly as he passed, not dramatically, but enough. James straightened just a fraction. Not defensively, just ready. Annie didn't move, she simply watched. William stopped a few feet away. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then he nodded once. Not for Mel, not forced, real. I said I'd come back, he said. James met his gaze. You did. A small pause. Then William glanced at Annie and I said, next time I'd be ready. Annie tilted her head slightly. Are you? William exhaled quietly. Not yet, he admitted. That answer hung in the air because it wasn't what anyone would have expected from him before. Not honesty like that, not here. James watched him carefully. What do you want? He asked. William didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor at the space then back at them. A game, he said, but this time it didn't sound like a challenge. It sounded like a request. And for the first time since they had met, no one in the room laughed. William didn't move any closer. He stood where he was, leaving space between himself and the man he had mocked the night before, the man he had underestimated, and the child who had dismantled that certainty without raising her voice. The distance mattered now, not as a barrier, but as acknowledgement. James rested both hands on the handle of the mop, steady, grounded, his posture neither defensive nor welcoming. He simply stood there, looking at William as one person looks at another when there is nothing left to hide. A game, James repeated. Not dismissive, not accepting, just repeating the words to understand them. William nodded once. Yes. The restaurant continued moving around them. Quiet footsteps, the soft clink of glassware, low voices that pretended not to listen, but the center of the room had shifted again, not with tension, but with focus. Annie stepped slightly forward, just enough to stand beside her father instead of behind him. Why? She asked. Her voice was calm, direct, the same tone she had used the night before. William looked at her, not surprised by the question this time. If anything, he seemed to expect it. Because I didn't understand the first one, he said. Annie tilted her head slightly. You understood the ending. William gave a faint, almost thoughtful breath. I understood that I lost, he said. That's not the same thing. That answer settled into the space between them differently than anything he had said before. James watched him carefully. What do you think you missed? He asked. William didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved briefly across the room, then back again, as if he was measuring something. Not them, not the space, but himself. I thought the game started when I made the first move, he said slowly. James's expression didn't change. And now, William met his gaze. Now, I think it started before I even sat down. Annie's eyes shifted slightly. That's better, she said. William nodded faintly, but not enough, he added. There was no defensiveness in it. No pride, just clarity. A few seconds passed. Then James stepped away from the cart. Not dramatically, just a simple movement that carried more weight than anything else he had done since entering the room. You want to play, he said. William nodded. Yes. James glanced at Annie. She met his kaza. There was no hesitation there. Only a quiet question this time. Are you going to play? James turned back to William. Not here, he said. William's brow shifted slightly. Where? James looked around the restaurant. At the polished tables, the carefully arranged chairs. The space that had turned into something else the night before. Not in a place where the game isn't the only thing on the table, he said. William followed his gaze, understanding more quickly than before. No distractions, he said. James nodded. No assumptions. Annie added quietly. No audience. That one lingered, because it mattered. William exhaled slowly. All right, he said Apawa. Then he added, where? James thought for a moment. Then answered simply. After your day ends, he said, you come to where we play. William didn't ask where that was. Not yet. Instead, he nodded. I'll come. Another pause settled. Then Annie spoke again. One more thing. William looked at her. If you lose again, she said calmly. You don't get to pretend you didn't understand. There was no challenge in her tone. No edge, just a condition. William held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. That's fair. James watched him closely. Why are you doing this? He asked. Not suspicious, not accusing, just direct. William didn't look away this time. Because I don't like losing to something I didn't see, he said. Annie shook her head slightly. You didn't lose to something you didn't see, she said. You lost because you didn't want to see it. That hit differently, but William didn't argue. He absorbed it, then nodded once. Then I don't like that either, he said. Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was settled. A decision had been made. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. William straightened slightly. The composure he carried still there but no longer used as a shield. What time? He asked. James answered without hesitation. 7. William nodded. I'll be there. He turned to leave then stopped. Not at the door. Just before it, he didn't turn back immediately. But when he did, he didn't look at Annie. He looked at James. I was wrong about you, he said. Sampler direct. No explanation. No excuse. James didn't respond with words. He didn't need to because this time the acknowledgement was enough. William gave one final nod, then walked out. The door closed quietly behind him. And just like that, the room returned to itself. The staff resumed their movements. The quiet hum of work filled the space again, but something had changed. Not visibly, not for everyone, but for the 3 people who had stood in the center of it. Everything had shifted. James picked up the mop again, but his hands didn't tighten around it the way they had before. He moved more easily now, not because the work was different, but because he was. Annie stood beside him for a moment, then looked up. You're going to play. James glanced at her. Yes, she nodded. Good. A small pause, then she added. This time it matters. James looked at the floor, at the reflection of light across the marble, at the space where everything had started. Then back at her. Yeah, he said quietly. This time it does. And somewhere beyond the walls of the restaurant. The next game had already begun. The rest of the day passed without incident, but not without weight. James moved through his work with the same steady rhythm as always. Mop across marble, quiet steps between tables, small tasks completed with precision that no one had ever really questioned. But now, even the smallest movement felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just seen. Not by everyone, but enough. A few glances lingered longer than before. A few nods came without hesitation. Nothing obvious, nothing spoken out loud, but something had shifted beneath the surface. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself, but changes the way a room holds you. Annie stayed close for most of the afternoon, sitting near the back with a book she wasn't fully reading. Her attention drifting more often toward her father than the pages in her hands. Every so often, she would glance toward the entrance, as if measuring time not by the clock, but by expectation. 7 o'clock. It didn't feel far away. As the afternoon gave way to evening, the restaurant slowly filled, then emptied again. The rhythm of customers came and went, conversations rose and faded. And by the time the last table was cleared, the space returned to its quieter form, the version of it that existed after the performance ended. James rinsed out the mop bucket and set it aside, his movements unhurried but deliberate. Annie stood near the doorway now, her eyes fixed on the front entrance. You think he'll come? She asked. James didn't look up right away. Yes, he said. Annie nodded. Not hopeful, not doubtful, just certain. They finished up the last of the work together. The routine familiar enough that neither of them needed to speak. When it was done, James grabbed his coat, slinging it over his shoulder, and walked toward the exit. Annie was already there waiting. The air outside had cooled. The city lights brighter now against the darkening sky. The street hummed softly with evening life. Quieter than midday, but still awake. Still moving. They didn't leave. They stood just outside the entrance, waiting. A few minutes passed. Then more. Cars rolled by. People crossed the street. The world continued, unaware of the small moment holding its place on the edge of something larger. Annie shifted slightly, but didn't speak. James kept his gaze forward. Then a car pulled up across the street. Not loud, no dramatic, just precise. The engine cut off, the door opened. William Harrington stepped out. No suit jacket this time. No deliberate posture designed to control a room. Just a man walking across the street. His pace steady, his focus clear. He didn't hesitate at the door. He walked straight to them, stopped a few feet away. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then William nodded once. 7, he said. James glanced briefly at his watch. 7. Annie watched him carefully, not with suspicion, not with curiosity, with evaluation. William met her gaze, then looked back at James. So he said, "Where do we play?" James turned slightly, gesturing down the street. Not far. They walked together. No one led, no one followed. 3 figures moving through the evening city, their footsteps falling into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. The distance wasn't long, but it felt measured not just in blocks, but in something less visible. They turned onto a smaller street, then another. The lights dimmer here, the noise softer. Eventually, James stopped in front of a modest building, the kind most people would pass without noticing. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his keys, and opened the door. William stepped inside after them. The apartment was exactly as it had been that morning. Small, sampler, real. The go-board sat on the low table. The stones already set in their bowls, waiting. William's eyes moved across the room, not judging, not comparing, just observing. "This is where you play," he said. James nodded. "This is where it matters." William stepped closer to the table, looking down at the board. No polished surface, no audience, no advantage, just the game. He took a slow breath, then sat, not with the confidence of someone claiming a position, but with the awareness of someone stepping into something he hadn't fully understood before. James sat across from him. Annie remained standing for a moment, watching both of them, then moved to the side, settling into a spot where she could see the board clearly. No one spoke, not at first, because nothing needed to be said. William reached for a black stone, paused, then looked at James. "You start," he said. James raised an eyebrow slightly. "Why?" William leaned back just a fraction. "Because last time," he said. "I started before I understood what I was starting." James studied him for a moment, then nodded. He reached into the bowl, picked up a black stone, and placed it on the board. The sound was soft, but it carried. The game began. Annie watched closely. Not just the moves, the space between them. The way William didn't rush, the way James didn't hold back. Move by move, the board began to fill, not with tension, not with ego, but with intention. William's eyes stayed on the board longer now. He didn't glance away, didn't look for reactions. He stayed with the game. A few moves in he spoke. "Last night," he said quietly, "I thought control meant knowing what would happen next." James didn't look up. "And now," William placed his next stone carefully. "Now I think it means being ready for what you didn't see." Annie's eyes shifted slightly. James nodded once. "That's closer." The game continued. Slow, measured, honest, and for the first time there was no need to prove anything, only a need to understand. And this time, all 3 of them were playing. The room felt smaller once the game began, not because the walls had moved or the furniture had shifted, but because everything that mattered had narrowed to the space between the 2 men and the board that connected them. The city outside continued as it always did, voices, engines, distant movement. But inside the apartment, time slowed into something deliberate. William Harrington didn't rush his second move. His hand hovered over the bowl of white stones, fingers brushing lightly against their smooth surfaces before selecting one. He held it for a moment longer than necessary, as if weighing not just the move, but the intention behind it. Then he placed it on the board, not aggressively, not defensively, but carefully. James watched, not judging, not correcting, just seeing. Annie sat quietly to the side, her small frame still, her eyes following each shift on the board with a clarity that no longer needed to be proven. She wasn't waiting for a mistake. She was watching for understanding. A few moves passed without words. The board began to take shape. Not chaotic, not rigid, but balanced in a way that felt unfamiliar to what had happened the night before. William wasn't pushing. He wasn't forcing control. He was listening. James placed his next stone. "You're slower," he said. William nodded slightly. "Yes." "Why?" William didn't look up. "Because last time I wasn't paying attention to what mattered," he said. "I was reacting to what I thought I saw." Annie shifted slightly. "And now," William's eyes moved across the board. "Now I'm trying to see before I move," he said. James gave a faint nod. "That's the game." The words settled into the room quietly, not as instruction. As Corone, William placed another stone, this time closer to one of James's earlier positions, not attacking it, not avoiding it, but acknowledging it. The difference was subtle, but it was there. Annie noticed. "He's not trying to win fast," she said. James didn't look at her. "No." William allowed himself a small breath of recognition. "Winning fast was never the problem," he said. "Thinking I had already won was that admission didn't come with discomfort this time. It came with clarity." The game continued. Patterns formed. Spaces opened. Territories hinted at themselves, but didn't close too quickly. Each move felt like part of a conversation rather than a confrontation. After a while, James leaned back slightly. "You're leaving gaps," he said. William nodded. "I know. Why?" William placed another stone, this time deliberately creating a small opening along one side because not every space needs to be controlled, he said. Some need to be understood first. Annie's eyes flickered. That was new. James studied the board more carefully now, not because he needed to adjust, but because something had shifted in a way that couldn't be ignored. "You're not playing the same game," he said. William finally looked up. "No," he said, "I believe Pa." Then he added, "I don't think I ever was." Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was alignment, the kind that only comes when something real has been recognized. Annie leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on her knees. "You stopped trying to control everything," she said. William gave a faint nod. "Yes, does that feel different?" He thought about that, not quickly, not casually. Then he answered, "It feels less certain," he said. "But more honest." James smiled slightly. "That's usually how it works." The board continued to evolve. This time, there was no trap waiting quietly in the background. No hidden collapse designed to reveal itself too late. Instead, both sides built with awareness, testing, adjusting, allowing the shape to grow naturally. After several more moves, William paused. His hand hovered over a stone, then stopped. He looked at the board again. Longer, deeper. Then he leaned back slightly. "There it is," he said quietly. James didn't move. "What?" William pointed, not physically, but with his gaze. "The mistake," he said. Annie leaned forward, studying the position, but she didn't speak because she wanted to hear what he would do. William reached for the stone he had been about to place. Then, didn't. He set it back and chose a different one. The move he made instead wasn't strong. It wasn't dominant. It was corrective. James's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, in recognition. "You saw it before it cost you," he said. William nodded. "Yes." Annie's voice came softly. "That's new." William allowed himself a small, quiet smile. "It is." The game moved forward again, slower, clearer, not toward dominance, but toward resolution, and gradually the board began to settle. Not because one side had overtaken the other, but because both had reached a point where the outcome no longer needed to be forced. James placed another stone, then leaned back. "That's as far as it goes," he said. William studied the board, then nodded. Yes. He didn't reach for another stone. He didn't try to extend the game beyond its natural end. He simply sat there for a moment, looking, understanding. Then he exhaled slowly. "This one's different," he said. Annie tilted her head. "How?" William looked at her. "Last time, I didn't know when the game ended," he said. "This time, I do." James nodded once. "That matters." William glanced at the board again, then at James. "I didn't lose this one," he said. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't pride. It was observation. James met his gaze. "No," he said, "you didn't." Annie leaned back, her expression calm. "But you didn't win either." William smiled faintly. "I know." A small silence followed. Then he added, "I think that's the point." James stood slowly, not because the game was finished, but because something else had been. "Yeah," he said. "It is." William remained seated for another moment, then stood as well. He looked around the apartment again, not as a stranger this time, but as someone who had been allowed to see something real. "Thank you," he said. Not formal, not distant, real. James nodded. Annie watched him closely. "You see better now," she said. William met her gaze. "Not everything," he admitted. Annie nodded. "That's okay." He gave a small smile. "For now." He turned toward the door, then paused just before leaving. He looked back, not at the board, not at the room, but at both of them. "Next time," he said, "I won't need to be invited." James raised an eyebrow slightly. "That's so." William nodded. "Because I'll know where I stand." Annie smiled faintly. "That's when the real game starts." William didn't answer, but this time, he understood. He opened the door and stepped out into the night. And inside the small apartment, the board remained exactly as it was. Not a victory, not a defeat, but something far more difficult to earn. Understanding. And for all three of them, that had changed everything. This story reminds us that true strength is not shown through dominance, but through clarity, patience, and integrity. It teaches that silence is not always weakness, and speaking up is not always about winning. Sometimes it is about revealing the truth at the right moment. The greatest lesson is that people are often judged by appearances, but real value lies beneath what we can immediately see. When we choose to understand instead of control, to listen instead of assume, and to act with dignity rather than ego, we create space for growth not just in others, but in ourselves. In the end, the story shows that real victory is not defeating someone else, but learning to see clearly, respect others, and recognize what truly matters. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration.